Every Friday afternoon, you likely pack up your desk, clock out, and begin a two-day ritual of rest that feels as natural and permanent as gravity. You set your life to the rhythm of the 40-hour work week, trusting the boundary between your labor and your life. But that boundary is an illusion, a shockingly recent, fiercely contested invention. America had no legally mandated 40-hour work week until 1940. Before that moment, the concept of a weekend or a standardized quitting time simply did not exist for the vast majority of the population. So, who decided when you get to stop working? This is not merely a story about labor regulations or union slogans. It is the history of a century-long, often bloody war over the most valuable resource in human existence: time. It is the story of how industrial titans, desperate workers, and calculating politicians battled to design the fundamental architecture of modern life. To understand why you work the hours you do today, we have to look back to a time when the clock was a weapon. For thousands of years, human labor was dictated by nature. You worked when the sun rose, you stopped when the sun set. The seasons dictated the intensity of the work. It was grueling, but it possessed a natural elasticity. Then came the Industrial Revolution. In the early 19th century, the factory system arrived in America, and with it came a terrifying new master: the mechanical clock. Unlike a farm, a steam-powered textile mill in Massachusetts or a steel furnace in Pennsylvania did not need to sleep. Therefore, the owners reasoned, neither should the machines. And if the machines were to run constantly, the human beings attached to them must do the same. By the 1830s, the average American factory worker was laboring on a schedule that today would be considered a severe human rights violation. A typical shift lasted 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. The Sabbath was the only pause, granted not for rest, but for religious observance. You did not sell your skills to an employer, you sold your waking existence. The physical and psychological toll of this system was catastrophic. In the mills of Lowell, Massachusetts, young women, the primary workforce of early American textiles, breathed in cotton dust for 70 hours a week, their bodies breaking down before they reached their mid-20s. But capital had a compelling economic logic. The machines were incredibly expensive to build. The only way to maximize the return on that massive capital investment was continuous operation. Time spent not working was, literally, money lost. The idea of voluntarily shortening the workday was viewed by industrialists not just as economically foolish, but as a moral failing. Idleness, they argued, bred sin. Constant work was the crucible of a strong republic. But the workers trapped inside this crucible began to see it differently. They realized that without time of their own, they were effectively stripped of their citizenship. How could one participate in a democracy, read the news, or raise a family if every waking hour belonged to the mill owner? The first tremors of rebellion didn't ask for a 40-hour week. They would have settled for a 10-hour day. In the 1830s, carpenters, masons, and shipbuilders began to organize. They didn't just strike for wages, they struck for time. Their persistence yielded the first fragile victory in the war for time. In 1840, President Martin Van Buren issued an executive order mandating a 10-hour workday for laborers working on federal public works projects. It was a localized victory, applying only to a fraction of the workforce, but it established a radical precedent. The government could and would intervene to limit the hours a citizen could be compelled to work. However, the private sector ignored it entirely. As America hurtled toward the Gilded Age, factories grew larger, the machinery grew deadlier, and the hours remained brutal. The 10-hour movement was no longer enough. A new, more dangerous idea began to take root in the minds of the American working class. An idea summarized by a simple, rhythmic chant that would soon echo through the streets of Chicago and end in bloodshed. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. Following the Civil War, American capitalism entered a period of hyper-expansion known as the Gilded Age. Railroads conquered the continent, steel mills illuminated the night skies of Pennsylvania, but the engine driving this unprecedented accumulation of wealth was human exhaustion. As factories scaled up, the dangers scaled with them. Operating a steam-powered drop forge or coupling railroad cars required absolute concentration. But concentration is impossible when you are in your 14th hour of continuous labor. The industrial accident rate in late 19th century America was horrifying. Fatigue was not just a discomfort, it was a leading cause of dismemberment and death. In this environment of mechanical slaughter, a machinist named Ira Stewart began to articulate a revolutionary argument. Stewart didn't just appeal to morality, he appealed to economics. He argued that exhausted, impoverished workers were terrible consumers. If a man only had time to work and sleep, he would never buy a bicycle, attend a theater, or purchase a book. Stewart's philosophy was codified in the formation of the Grand 8-Hour League in 1865. His logic was a direct challenge to the industrialists of the era. Give workers back their time, and you will create a domestic market of consumers that will drive true economic growth. It was a brilliant theoretical framework, but capital was not interested in theory. They held the power, and they had no intention of relinquishing a single minute. Frustrated by decades of political indifference, the labor movement decided to force the issue. In 1884, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions, the precursor to the modern AFL, drew a line in the sand. They passed a resolution stating that starting May 1, 1886, 8 hours shall constitute a legal day's labor. They did not ask Congress to pass a law. They did not petition the president. They simply announced that on that specific spring day, hundreds of thousands of workers would lay down their tools after 8 hours and walk out. It was a staggering assertion of collective leverage. As May 1886 approached, panic gripped the American business establishment. Newspapers warned of impending communist revolutions and anarchist uprisings. Factory owners hired private Pinkerton detectives and stockpiled Winchester rifles. When May 1st arrived, the sheer scale of the action was breathtaking. Across the country, an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 workers went on strike. Trains stopped running. Construction sites fell silent. In Chicago, the epicenter of radical labor organization, 40,000 workers marched down Michigan Avenue. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the working class had peacefully stopped the gears of American industry. But the illusion of a bloodless victory would last exactly 3 days. On May 3rd, the tension snapped. Striking workers clashed with strikebreakers outside the massive McCormick Harvesting Machine Company in Chicago. The police arrived, opened fire into the crowd, and killed at least 2 striking workers. Outraged, local anarchist and labor leaders printed thousands of flyers calling for a mass protest the following evening at a place called Haymarket Square. The gathering on May 4th, 1886, began peacefully. The mayor of Chicago even attended, listened to the speeches, and, deeming the crowd orderly, went home. But as a light rain began to fall and the crowd thinned, a contingent of heavily armed police marched into the square, ordering the remaining speakers to disperse. Then, someone, to this day history does not know who, threw a dynamite bomb into the ranks of the police. The explosion was deafening. It killed one officer instantly and fatally wounded several others. In the ensuing chaos, police fired blindly into the dark, killing and wounding an unknown number of civilians and their own men. The Haymarket affair was a disaster for the 8-hour movement. The American public, fueled by hysterical press coverage, instantly conflated the demand for an 8-hour day with terrorism and violent anarchism. The state demanded blood. 8 men, mostly German immigrants who were prominent in the labor movement, were arrested and tried for murder. The trial was a spectacular miscarriage of justice. No evidence was ever presented that any of the men threw the bomb. In fact, several weren't even in the square when it detonated. They were convicted not for their actions, but for their political beliefs and their leadership in the fight for time. 4 of the men were hanged. 1 died by suicide in his cell. The immediate consequence of Haymarket was a devastating chilling effect. The 8-hour movement was fractured, stripped of its leadership, and smeared with the stain of treason. The unified, nationwide push for a standardized workday collapsed. Employers seized the momentum, rolling back the fragile gains workers had made. The 14-hour day returned with a vengeance. The battle for time had proven fatal. But the fundamental economic friction, the conflict between the limits of the human body and the limitless appetite of industrial capital, remained unresolved. If a national strike could not win the 8-hour day, the fight would have to shift from the streets to the courtrooms, setting the stage for a dramatic legal collision at the dawn of the 20th century. With the labor movement fractured by the fallout of the Haymarket affair, the battlefield for time shifted. If a national strike could be crushed by police and public hysteria, reformers realized they had to change tactics. They turned to state legislatures, lobbying for local laws to cap working hours in specific, highly dangerous industries. But as these laws passed, industrial capital deployed a devastating new weapon, the United States Constitution. Following the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was ratified to protect the civil rights of formerly enslaved people, guaranteeing that no state could deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, corporate lawyers executed a breathtaking legal maneuver. They successfully argued to the courts that corporations were persons, and that government limits on working hours violated a worker's liberty of contract, their supposed constitutional right to negotiate their own exploitation. This legal doctrine culminated in a 1905 Supreme Court case that would define a dark era of American jurisprudence. In New York, the state legislature had passed the Bake Shop Act, a law prohibiting bakery employees from working more than 10 hours a day or 60 hours a week. The law was a desperate public health measure. Bakers were confined to subterranean, unventilated cellars, inhaling flour dust for 100 hours a week, leading to rampant tuberculosis. Joseph Lochner, a bakery owner fined for violating the act, appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. In a landmark 5-4 decision, the court struck down the New York law. The majority ruled that bakers possessed the liberty to work as many hours as they wished, and the state had no right to interfere. The Lochner decision essentially outlawed the very concept of maximum hour legislation. The message from the highest court in the land was clear. If an employer demanded a 16-hour day and a worker facing starvation agreed to it, the government was powerless to intervene. The Lochner ruling plunged labor advocates into despair. How could they defeat a constitutional blockade? The answer came 3 years later, in 1908, through a brilliant, if deeply compromised, legal strategy in a case called Muller versus Oregon. Oregon had passed a law limiting women working in laundries and factories to 10 hours a day. When a laundry owner challenged the law, the state hired a formidable lawyer named Louis Brandeis. Brandeis knew he couldn't win on legal precedent alone, so he changed the rules of the game. He submitted what became known as the Brandeis Brief. Instead of focusing on abstract constitutional theory, the brief contained 2 pages of legal argument and over 100 pages of medical, sociological, and economic data detailing the catastrophic physical toll that long hours took on the human body. Brandeis forced the court to look at reality, not just theory, and he won. The Supreme Court upheld the Oregon law, but it was a victory with a bitter caveat. The court justified the ruling not by recognizing the universal need for rest, but by leaning heavily on the sexism of the era, arguing that women required special state protection due to their physical frailty and their role in maternal reproduction. It was a fractured, unequal precedent. Men were still left completely unprotected by the federal courts. It would take the threat of absolute national paralysis to force the federal government's hand. By 1916, Europe was consumed by the First World War, and the American economy was running red hot, supplying the Allied powers. The nation's vascular system was its railroads. Recognizing their immense leverage, the four major railway brotherhoods, representing 400,000 workers, issued an ultimatum. Grant us an 8-hour day, or we will shut down the entire American rail network. President Woodrow Wilson panicked. A rail strike would instantly cripple the U.S. economy and sever the supply chain to Europe. When railroad executives refused to compromise, Wilson bypassed the courts entirely. He went directly to Congress and rammed through the Adamson Act of 1916, legally mandating an 8-hour day for interstate railroad workers. For the first time in American history, the federal government had intervened to establish a maximum workday for private sector employees. But it was a crisis measure, applied only to a single, critical industry. For everyone else, the grueling endurance test continued. Ironically, the final catalyst for the modern workweek didn't come from a union hall or a courtroom. It came from the very apex of industrial capitalism. In 1926, Henry Ford shocked the business world by abruptly instituting a 5-day, 40-hour workweek for his factory workers, with no reduction in pay. Ford was not motivated by altruism. He was an efficiency fanatic and a ruthless capitalist. He realized that the relentless pace of his own invention, the moving assembly line, was burning out his workforce, leading to high turnover and costly errors. More importantly, Ford understood the economic theory that Ira Stewart had pleaded for 60 years earlier. Ford was mass-producing automobiles. To sustain his empire, he needed a mass market of consumers to buy them. Leisure is an indispensable prerequisite for a growing consumer market, Ford stated. If workers were trapped in the factory 6 days a week, they would never have the time to buy, drive, and wear out a Model T. By giving them a weekend, he was literally manufacturing consumers for his own products. Ford's decision proved wildly profitable, setting a new standard for corporate efficiency. But voluntary corporate benevolence is fragile. As the Roaring '20s crashed violently into the Great Depression, the limitations of relying on the goodwill of billionaires would be laid bare, setting the stage for the ultimate, binding codification of American time. The prosperity of Henry Ford's Roaring '20s proved to be a fragile facade. When the stock market collapsed in 1929, plunging the nation into the Great Depression, the entire economic landscape fractured. The battle for time suddenly inverted. For a century, workers had fought for the right to work less, seeking rest from grueling endurance tests. Now millions were fighting for the right to work at all. In the depths of the Depression, the logic behind shortening the workweek fundamentally shifted. It was no longer just a crusade for public health or a strategy to manufacture consumers. It became a desperate arithmetic of survival known as work sharing. If there was only a limited amount of work available in a paralyzed economy, politicians argued, that work should be rationed. If you legally force employers to cut a man's hours from 60 to 30, the employer will be forced to hire a second man to make up the difference. This desperate logic materialized in 1933 with the Black-Connery Bill. Introduced by Senator Hugo Black, the bill proposed a radical, immediate, and mandatory 30-hour workweek across American industry. The bill terrified the business establishment, but it passed the Senate with overwhelming support. The American public was hungry for drastic intervention. However, newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt hesitated. He believed a sudden, rigid 30-hour cap would bankrupt struggling businesses and paralyze the nascent economic recovery. FDR opposed the Black-Connery Bill, maneuvering to replace it with his own sprawling, complex, and ultimately unconstitutional National Industrial Recovery Act. But the political pressure for a permanent federal solution to the crisis of working hours was now unstoppable. The working class had realized that relying on the benevolence of men like Henry Ford or the localized strength of exhausted unions was not enough. They needed the ultimate coercive power of the federal government to draw a permanent line in the sand. The climax of the century-long war for time arrived on June 25, 1938. After years of bitter congressional infighting, President Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA. It is arguably the most consequential piece of labor legislation in American history, for it installed the fundamental architecture of the modern working life. The FLSA established a federal minimum wage, outlawed oppressive child labor, and crucially, created a national standard for working hours. It mandated a maximum 44-hour work week, which was legally scheduled to step down year by year until it hit a hard floor of 40 hours in October 1940. But the genius of the FLSA was its enforcement mechanism. It did not make working more than 40 hours illegal. Instead, it made it expensive. The law introduced the concept of the overtime premium. If an employer required an employee to work beyond the 40-hour boundary, they were legally compelled to pay time and a half, a 50% financial penalty for every extra hour. By weaponizing the profit motive against the employers themselves, the federal government successfully engineered the weekend. On October 24, 1940, the 40-hour work week officially became the law of the land. Millions of industrial and clerical workers finally won the time that Ira Stewart had bled for decades earlier. But this victory was built on a dark, foundational compromise. To pass the FLSA, Roosevelt needed the votes of Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats. These politicians refused to support any federal law that would raise wages or limit hours for the black workforce that formed the backbone of the Southern agrarian economy. To secure their votes, the architects of the FLSA deliberately carved out massive exemptions. The law entirely excluded agricultural workers and domestic servants. Consequently, millions of minorities and women were locked out of the 40-hour week and denied the legal right to a weekend. They were left behind in the Gilded Age, legally stripped of the protections granted to the industrial, predominantly white, male workforce. The boundaries drawn in 1940 are still the ones you live by today, but that architecture is crumbling. The FLSA was designed for an economy of factories and typewriters, where work was a physical place you could leave. Today, the lines are blurring. Millions of salaried employees are legally classified as exempt from overtime, turning the 40-hour cap into a mere suggestion. The rise of the gig economy has classified millions more as independent contractors, completely sidestepping the protections of the 1938 law, recreating the piece rate exhaustion of the 19th century. And the mechanical clock of the textile mill has been replaced by the digital tether in your pocket. When your employer can reach you in your bed, on your commute, and at your dinner table, the boundary between labor and life dissolves. The weekend is not a natural phenomenon. It is not an inevitable byproduct of human progress. It is a man-made structure paid for in blood, strikes, and political compromises. For a brief window in history, society decided that the human machine required a mandatory pause, that you are entitled to a portion of your life that capital cannot buy. But as the nature of work changes, the war for time is quietly resuming. The question is no longer just who decided when you get to stop. The question you must ask yourself today is, have you actually stopped at all? If you want to understand the hidden architecture of the world you live in, the invisible laws, silent agreements, and forgotten battles that dictate your daily life, subscribe to our channel. We don't just recount history, we decode the mechanics of modern power. Next time, we investigate a number that dictates where you can live, what you can drive, and whether you can participate in the modern economy, and why the standardized credit score we know today wasn't introduced until 1989.